Non-Western or anti-Western? There are strong arguments in favour of a new multipolar world order, but have some countries hijacked the idea of countering US influence for their own gain? The latest BRICS Leaders Summit has just wrapped up. Is it really a viable global alternative or just the latest platform to air anti-US grievances? It's up for debate on CounterPoints with me, Melinda Nusafora. BRICS is the Global South's answer to the G7, a collective of emerging economies looking to challenge Western dominance.
We all see that fundamental changes are taking place in the world. The unipolar system of international relations that serve the interests of the so-called golden billion is becoming a thing of the past. It is being replaced by a more just, multipolar world.
And he has a point. A lot has changed since the end of the Cold War, when the US took the lead on the world stage and its currency became the global benchmark. But how much of this push for a new world order is really a push for an anti-America agenda, especially from countries like Russia and China, which are looking for ways to circumvent US sanctions or restrictions? If a shake-up of the world order really is necessary, how do multiple countries with diverse economies and political systems work together for the collective good? BRICS is an example of just how hard it can be to square that circle. China and India are strategic competitors and embroiled in a long-running border dispute. New members, Egypt and Ethiopia, are at odds over the Nile River Dam, and Brazil, unlike Russia and China, wants to avoid a focus on geopolitical confrontation. Coming up on this episode of CounterPoints, we'll ask, has the unipolar world order been a failure, and is it time for a shake-up? Is BRICS a viable alternative? And has the push for a non-Western grouping morphed into an anti-American platform? Stay with us, the debate is coming up. Joining us to discuss BRICS and whether it poses a challenge to the US-led order, I'm joined by Carla, a former US ambassador in President Donald Trump's first administration and current Vice President for Energy and Environment at the America First Policy Institute. Then we've got Andy Mock, Professor at Beijing Foreign Studies University and a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for China and Globalisation. And rounding out our CounterPoints panel, Oliver Stunkel, a political scientist and Professor of International Relations at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in São Paulo. Everyone, welcome to CounterPoints. Well, when the Soviet Union collapsed, so too did the system of bipolar world order, with no USSR to counter it. The US was left as the unparalleled superpower, economically, militarily, and politically. But times are changing. Whether the US is abdicating its role or the balance of power is simply being redistributed, some countries are no longer comfortable being resigned to followers in a US-led world. So, Carla, let's start with you. Has the US failed in its role as the unipolar world leader?
Well, certainly you're right that it's not a bipolar world where we had the Cold War with the USSR versus the US, and everyone else was sort of players in that world. Today, we have a rising China, we have a rising India, and the EU is still, I would say, a strong world power, certainly economically. But in spite of it being a multipolar world, the United States is clearly still the leader of the world. And I hope under President Trump's leadership that it remains that way, because the United States spreads freedom of speech, freedom from oppression, right? Human rights, the right for women to be equal to men, the right to practice one's own religion, the right to gather in a public space and not be oppressed by the government. All these things are freedoms that the United States and the Western world have shared with the rest of the world. So in order for the world to benefit from the beautiful freedoms that have been shared by the West, the United States must stay I would say, leader in the world. We also don't spread the kind of negative things that some of our adversaries, certainly President Trump, peace president, and he stands for peace. He stands for economic prosperity, for energy security for all countries. And the fact that he is leading in that way is for me, very inspiring. And I hope it is for the rest of the world as well. We can see African nation leaders meeting with him today at the White House. They want to do more trade with the United States as well.
Okay, Andy, what do you make of that? Do you agree that the US remains the only viable leader of the free world?
Well, Melinda, I would actually say that we are not yet in a multipolar world, and in many important ways, we are in a bipolar world that is in many important ways not that different from the US rivalry with the Soviet Union, in that there really are two global superpowers. So the US, in terms of its economy, in terms of its technological level, China really is the only other peer competitor. And I think if we look at statements from people like Elbridge Colby, who I believe also served in the first Trump administration, also was in the second, we look at SecDef Hegseth's statement about the importance of China as a pacing challenge, economically as well as militarily, that whether China wants it or not, certainly the US is treating China as an adversary. And I think, Carla makes some very interesting points that are really just maybe ideological talking points about so-called freedom, et cetera. When we think about this question of freedom, it's freedom from economic insecurity, freedom from worry about violence, things like that, that it's a much broader conception of freedom and human rights. And if we look at China's record, certainly since 1978, with the beginning of opening and economic reform, China's not only lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, lifted them into the middle class, but also, I think, improved human rights for China in many, many important ways. Now, of course, the political system is founded on very different values that go back not just to the CPC, but I would say to the very roots of Chinese civilization going back thousands of years. And in some ways, this is also the cause of this conflict, in that the US starts from what some might describe as politics masquerading as an extreme religious ideology.
Oliver, I'm going to bring you in just a moment, but before I do, Carla, go ahead, Carla.
Yeah, I do. I just have to say the United States over the past decades, is certainly in the 20th and 21st century, have lifted billions of people out of poverty and starvation because of sharing our beneficial economy, and our missionaries, our business leaders going around the world, our government, taxpayer dollars and charitable dollars pulling people out of starvation and poverty. It's been the #1 lifter of people out of poverty, the United States, in the world's history. And secondly, you look at the Uyghur people in China being oppressed, over 1 million Muslims imprisoned, tortured, raped, made to lose their native language and their religion, and other minorities being oppressed as well in China, within China, or what China claims is China. And I will just say, human rights and China do not belong in the same sentence.
Okay.
Well, Carla, your
ahead.
sentiment is certainly appreciated, even though the facts don't support it. But I would say that if we look at the U.S. economic system,
Yes, they do.
how many Americans are on the verge of economic security? I saw a number that, the percentage of Americans with less than $400 in their bank account is shockingly large. And we look at, for example, in China, by comparison, 22 million US dollars in household savings. So, reasonable people can disagree about the degree of accomplishment, but certainly I respect your passion, but only wish that the facts would support it.
Well,
Okay.
the facts, just one more thing, the facts do say that even the poorest Americans have more money than most people in the world. In fact, Germany, which is a rich European country, has a GDP lower than the lowest U.S. state. The American people, even the ones that claim to be poor and oppressed, have more than most people around the world. So that's a false that you're sharing.
Okay, I want to bring in Oliver here. We're seeing very clearly how we've got US and China playing out on counterpoints and on the world stage. From the external perspective of that, how do you consider, how would you score the way that the US has led from the front? And is it still, or do you agree with what Andy is saying, and China is now a very real competitor?
No, thank you. So I think from a Brazilian point of view, and many other countries in the global south, the strategy is diversification, multi-alignment. I think there's a lot of pragmatism in these countries because they depend economically on viable economic relationships to both major powers. I think we're perhaps in the transition from a bipolar world to a multipolar world. The kind of movement that Russia has made by invading Ukraine is clearly a signal of a multipolar world because Russia says, I do have a sphere of influence. That's essentially something countries do in multipolar orders. I think it doesn't really have much to do with politics. Russia could not have invaded Ukraine 20 years ago because Western sanctions on Russia would have been too much for Russia to handle. Now we're in a multipolar world. Russia can depend on China, can depend on India and other countries. So this is the kind of instability we tend to see historically in multipolar orders. And most countries don't want to take sides. They want to sort of largely leave politics aside. Brazil is a key example. The United States is the main investor in Brazil, but China is the main buyer of Brazilian products. Which is quite interesting. We have a trade deficit with the United States and a large surplus with China. So there's a consensus in these countries that in the midst of this transition of global order, the best thing we can do is try to, as much as possible, preserve ties to all actors. Brazil is a major non-NATO ally of the United States, is moving relatively close to the OECD, is trying to ratify a trade deal with the Europeans. Mm-hmm. And it's also economically very close to China and has hosted yesterday Prime Minister Modi for a state visit and is very keen to deepen ties as well. So I think from that sort of global South perspective, I would say mostly transitioning away from bipolarity towards multipolarity. But all that, I think, shows how successful global order has been for the past decades. In a way, it's just natural. I mean, it shows how many countries have been able to succeed. And one of the key goals of countries like Brazil is to preserve the rules and norms as much as possible, which allows a country like Brazil to invest very, very little in defense and more in infrastructure, health, and areas of high social returns.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you mentioned multi-alignment because we are going to come to that in one of our later segments. But something that you said, I want to throw to you, Carla. When we hear Oliver talk about multi-alignment, a country like Brazil, aligned with China, aligned with the United States. No one's picking, well, a lot of countries aren't picking sides. So if the US has done such a great job leading from the front, why do you think that some countries, particularly in the global south, are looking for other alternatives?
Well, it's a little different in the Western Southern Hemisphere than it is, for instance, in Africa or India. South America, Central America, the Caribbean, it's on the United States. It's our fault that we did not enforce the Wilson Doctrine, that we did not take care of our own hemisphere and make sure that it was secure. We had weak presidents, and presidents, frankly, their attention was elsewhere, unfortunately. And so we allowed China to come into our area. Also, Iran is causing a lot of trouble in South America, Central America, also, and Russia has a presence, and they're very destabilizing to South America. So it's causing a lot of turmoil in the South. And then we haven't done enough trade with South American countries. For instance, yes, maybe Brazil has a trade deficit with us, but there are other countries that have a trade surplus with us. We have a trade surplus with them, to correct that. China wants to use Brazil as basically their farm backyard, and they don't plan to invest. They generally don't invest in these countries. They kind of just take what they want. There's no value chain that brings good paying jobs to the countries. I'll just give an example. In Lima, Peru, they're building the Chanque port, and there's no value chain. They're just pulling the minerals out of Peru and sending them to China for processing. They're not processing in Peru. So they're taking advantage of these countries. The countries don't have enough leverage, I guess, to cut a better trade deal with China. So they're basically just removing the wealth of these countries back to China rather than improving the lot of the people, which is a project that the United States has done over the decades and centuries around the world. But it's on us that this has happened. I know President Trump is looking at South America, Central America, and the Caribbean and saying, we need to get this in a better place. Africa, we did not pay attention to Africa, and Africa really is desiring to have their own industrial revolution to benefit the people of Africa. It's time for Africa to rise. China brings their own labor. China pulls the wealth out of Africa. They don't really benefit the people, and there's corruption that they bring as well. Sure.
Okay, Andy, respond to that, and then we're going to move on to our next segment. Is it just that there have been weak US presidents, and that's the only reason China's got a foot in the door here? Or is that simplifying things too much?
Well, first, let me just make an observation that I think Carla has enormously creative use of language to say that China's taking resources from Brazil or Peru. This is trade, as I'm sure she must know, that China pays for the soybeans from Brazil or from minerals that they purchase in Peru. They invest in Chanque port, creating relatively high-paying port jobs as well. So I think that's important to clarify. When we look at in a broader picture, what's happening here is that, so China with 1.4 billion people has increased per capita incomes by phenomenal amounts since 1978. It started out becoming the so-called workshop of the world, so creating enormous demand for inputs, whether that's iron ore, et cetera, from Australia, soybeans from Brazil. So actually it's been an enormous growth engine for global prosperity. So that has changed. And of course, as the Chinese people have become wealthier and more discriminating, creating enormous demand for consumer goods all around the world. And I think this is exerting a gravitational pull that is increasingly greater than that offered by the United States. At the same time, I would agree, I think Carla and I are on the same page here, that the US faces existential challenges that include unsustainable government debt, budget deficit, a sclerotic public bureaucracy, and deindustrialization. And I think President Trump has the courage and the vision to address these. Now, whether the execution matches the correct diagnosis, I think remains to be seen. But as I'm sure we'll talk about, this is creating tremendous collateral damage, even amongst traditional American allies like South Korea, Japan, etc., NATO, that I describe as a ratchet, meaning that even if President Trump withdraws, amends his tariff coercion against many countries around the world, that it is permanently weakening the United States, even if another president takes office that tries to or has the exact opposite policies, that the U.S. is ratcheting down and in a position to unable to recover. And I think this is a dynamic that is only being accelerated by the current Trump administration.
Okay, we're going to come to tariffs in a little while, but I just want to move on to our next segment, because let's focus more specifically on what an alternative would be to this new desire for a multipolar world order. If countries want to shake up the global power balance, they need to provide an effective alternative. And BRICS is being held up as just that. It's grown from the original 4 members to the current 10, possibly 11, and it now outpaces the G7 in terms of global population and economic growth. But internal divisions mean it struggles to achieve its headline goals. So, Oliver, what's your take? Is BRICS a viable alternative to a Western-led world order?
So I think there's 2 slightly exaggerated notions that are quite popular of BRICS. The first is that they're way too different from each other, and as a consequence, we can ignore the meetings altogether. By the way, it's just much more than just a leaders meeting. It's around 100 meetings involving ministerial, civil society, and all sorts of engagements. The other is that people in favor of BRICS say that they can lead the new global order, or people in the West fearing that BRICS may seek to overthrow the existing order. That is also not the case. I think it's somewhat comparable to the G7. Recently, the G7 was unable to articulate a final declaration because divisions were too large. Divisions are also quite significant amongst BRICS countries. I mean, there's a group of countries that are fairly explicitly anti-Western, led by Russia and Iran. And there are countries that are embracing what most governments call multi-alignment. Like countries like India, for example, want to strengthen their ties to the United States, but they react to multipolarity and also join a grouping like BRICS, which allows them to diversify their partnership, have options, and hedge, basically. I think what countries like to do is to hedge given global turbulence. Now, it's really interesting to point out, if you read the final declaration, a lot of the stuff there is reaffirming the rules and norms of existing order. So the BRICS say in the recent final document approved in Rio that we need a strong and agile international monetary fund. We need a free trade. We need a strong World Trade Organization. We need a strong international cooperation on global health. They're not revolutionaries. They're not seeking to undermine existing institutions. In large part, there's obviously Iran out there, which is quite a radical member. Brazil is very much opposed to Iran joining. But all in all, they're not hell-bent on overthrowing what is, but seeking to engage and to reform some of these institutions, because not necessarily are the existing institutions seen as Western-led. I mean, the UN is not a Western-led institution, right? It's an institution where countries in the global South have played a very important role. So I think probably BRICS won't achieve that much when it comes to creating new institutions, but at the same time, they are clearly, despite their limitations, seeking to adapt to what is increasingly a multipolar order, which is not as dominated by the West, and in a way that's also normal. If you look at the demographic distribution in the world, the vast majority of people live in Asia. So it's only natural, if they develop economically, that they are bound to have a greater geopolitical role. So I think it's a bit of both. And of course, it was quite funny that talking to diplomats in Rio, you did have fairly a sleepy summit, and then Trump tweeted at the end of the first day, and he threatened to impose tariffs, and it sort of jolted the summit. It was quite interesting. there was this, as if everybody sort of woke up and said, this is putting us on the map in a way that we hadn't perhaps intended. And I think there's two ways of looking at what Trump basically did. The first is that he's seeking to disincentivize other countries from joining BRICS, like Turkey. Turkey's actively has applied to join BRICS. It's also a NATO member. Or he will produce a rally around the flag effect that despite the divisions, BRICS countries will actually facing a common threat, will sort of, it ends up doing exactly the opposite of what Trump wanted, which is to unite them. I think it will probably a bit of both, but divisions obviously are quite significant and will make it difficult for BRICS to create new institutions beyond what we've already seen over the past 15 years.
Carla, what's your read on that? Do you think that BRICS does pose a bit of a threat to the US and its lead on the global stage? Is it a viable alternative?
You know, Melinda, it is quite the question. So BRICS, conceived by China, to remember that they have openly said, the leadership has openly said, despite what other people are saying here, they intend to become the global hegemon. They want to push the United States out of the leadership role in the world and have the world follow, I think they call it, socialism. Well, if you look at who's in BRICS, Iran, China, you really want to be in a trade partnership with those three. Those are not, look at the leadership and how they treat their own people and what's happening in the world because of their activities. Not the best of bedfellows, I would say. And they're seeking also to plant the United States in trade by using a gold-backed currency that's to the dollar. And I think India has said they're not going to be part of that. Part of it is to be able to cut out the dollar so that they can't be sanctioned, so that they can conduct, not so good trade. Because if you're a good actor, it doesn't matter if you trade in the dollar. No one's going to touch you because that is just how it's been. To follow China's lead in this, I think it's very dangerous. 10% tariff on anyone who's participating, any country who's participating. I would imagine he's going to raise that tariff over time because, first of all, a China-led organization is, and you're right, it's big, is a threat certainly to the West and to the actors around the world.
Andy, what do you make of that? Is that fair? Do you think that BRICS is just pretending that it doesn't want to take on the US for this dominance on the world stage, but also
China?
If BRICS is trying to be a global head with China at the front of BRICS, do you think China is using BRICS a little bit to give it another tool to kind of counter the US?
Well, first, Belinda, I would challenge this framing of China wanting to be a global hegemon. So I think no leader of any country wakes up, at least in contemporary history, wake up saying that they want to take over the world, turn over an existing order. Now, certainly some in the United States, either for personal benefit or perhaps misguided beliefs, do have this paranoid feeling, right? But I think that it's to solve a problem. So one problem that many countries around the world have, not just China, is the weaponization of the US dollar and the global payment system, SWIFT. So we see this especially come into focus with the Ukraine conflict, where the US, basically was able to exercise its power to seize Russian assets. And I think this really made many countries around the world think that, it's better to have an alternative. And so I would say that BRICS is not meant to replace the so-called Western system, but to provide an alternative. And if we look at the business world, anytime you have a monopoly, generally that's not a good thing for the customers. So if you have a choice, in a way, that keeps everyone on their toes. And I think actually is beneficial for the U.S. as well, in that it will perhaps moderate some of its more extreme impulses. Because again, we see countries can vote with their feet, as we're seeing perhaps recently in the United States with the debt market, where 10-year rates have been rising. Usually when we see stress, they fall because investors, countries around the world see U.S. treasuries and the dollar as a safe haven. So they buy up U.S. government treasuries when there's any kind of crisis. And we're seeing the opposite. And I think it's precisely that countries around the world are seeing increasingly there are alternatives.
And before we move on to our final segment, I just wanted to ask you, Oliver, what your take is on that, this notion that is China trying to mould BRICS in its image to give itself more leverage, or do you think the BRICS members operate very equally? Because China is painfully outstrips a lot of the other BRICS members. I mean, I think that their GDP outranks all the other members combined.
Well, absolutely. I mean, China is certainly the most important actor within BRICS. Now, having said that, countries are free to leave BRICS whenever they wish to do so. And I think the sense that being part of BRICS somehow forces countries to align with China is not palpable, I would say, when speaking to, say, diplomats in India or in Brazil. I mean, I think the trade issue by most of these countries is seen as a fairly in a pragmatic fashion. I think that Brazil increasingly sells products to China because of the economic complementarity. I mean, China demands soy just as it demanded U.S. soy, and the United States doesn't offer a trade deal to Brazil for a very obvious reason, because Brazil's agriculture is more competitive than U.S. agriculture. Those are red states, and they would certainly oppose a deal with Brazil and would criticize Trump. So he has no interest in offering a trade deal to countries like Brazil, and they look for markets, and certainly important markets nowadays exist both in North America and Europe, but also in countries like India, China, and Indonesia, which just joined BRICS. So I think the political aspect of BRICS is not that relevant, also because when you look at the currency alternatives, for example, Brazil and India are actually actively blocking Russian attempts to create a BRICS currency. So the Trump pressure may actually end up, as I said, add a uniting factor to the BRICS conversations, particularly if the United States will actually impose tariffs on BRICS countries. It's extremely difficult to imagine a world in which Brazil would somehow reduce its trade to China, because there's nothing really specific that the Trump administration is saying, we will offer you X if you end up trading less with BRICS, or if you leave BRICS. In fact, it's quite remarkable that for now, at least, the Trump administration's strategy vis-a-vis Latin America and Brazil is pretty much all sticks, no carrots, right? There's very little right now that sort of Trump says, we give you preferential access to the American market. But that doesn't mean that all BRICS countries are aligned with China. I think they're, in a sense, much less ideological about this, and sort of try to be as much focused on the business side and the strategic flexibility that having many partners gives them.
That point from you, Oliver, leads us perfectly into our final segment, because President Trump has declared BRICS anti-American and has even threatened every member with an additional 10% tariff, as you mentioned. Let's take a listen to what President Trump said.
They have to pay 10% if they're in BRICS, because BRICS was set up to hurt us. BRICS was set up to degenerate our dollar and take our dollar as the standard, take it off as the standard. And that's okay if they want to play that game, but I can play that game too.
Well, Brazil's president disputes that accusation that BRICS is anti-America, but he did add that the world doesn't need or want an emperor. Here's what President Lula said.
The BRICS group was not formed to confront anyone. It just wants to be another model, another way to do politics.
Okay, Andy, what's your take on that? Has the push for a new world order or a shake-up of global dominance morphed into an anti-America platform?
I certainly don't think so, Belinda. And I think here there is I think, very profound misunderstanding of China's objectives. So when we hear, these rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, the Chinese dream, and perhaps it's understandable that in some parts of the world, especially in the United States, that it's interpreted as a desire to replace the United States as the global hegemon. And I think a more helpful way of understanding this is that what China is doing is providing the operating system layer. And what the US fears is that China is providing an app to replace the American app. And the American way of doing things is that we not only want trade, investment, et cetera, but we also want every country around the world to adopt American values, to believe in freedom, quote unquote freedom, the way Americans define freedom, the free market system as the US defines the free market system. And I think the Chinese have a very, very different approach. And, really, as formally stated, mutual respect, non-interference in another country's affairs, respecting each country's development model and development choices. So I think what China's looking to do to increase its national security is to promote a safe and stable global environment that, one, minimizes military interventions, as we've seen with the United States, with Iraq, the recent attack against Iran, that these are, from China's view, incredibly disruptive and destabilizing. Mm-hmm. So providing a operating system that lets each country make its own choices. If you want to own guns, Second Amendment rights, from the Chinese perspective, they don't have a view one way or another. You're pro-abortion, anti-abortion, that's your country's domestic decisions. But what China does want, again, is a peaceful, stable, global environment so each country can prosper in its own way.
Mm-hmm. Carla, what do you make of that? Is BRICS necessarily anti-American?
Well, in a word, yes. So first of all, it's pretty rich what you've just been saying, Andy. The war that Russia is prosecuting on Ukraine right now would end tomorrow if China withdrew its support. The support, financial support, and support of the inputs that Russia needs. Secondly, it's pretty rich to talk about abortion when China forced women to have abortions through the decades to just the terror of women in China. People try desperately to get into the United States. They are not trying to run to the border of China and get into China for that freedom and that liberty that the United States stands for and shares around the world. That's that's not just ideological, that's a fact. And the BRICS is a threat to the United States. Russia and China are trying to use BRICS to destabilize and diminish the United States. It's a threat to our economic and our political activity. And that's why President Trump used strong words, and he will continue to. Mm-hmm. Why would you want to get in bed with some of the worst actors in the world? I understand the trade piece. Absolutely. We're all doing trade with each other. But the leadership by China, by Russia, by Iran, when you look at what they bring, it is what most people are running away from, not running to.
Okay. Oliver, I'm going to bring you in, but first of all, I need to just let Andy respond directly to what Carla has been saying.
Well, I certainly don't have much to say to that. Maybe it's a question. Carla, have you been to China?
Yes.
Yes?
Could you repeat that, Carla? We just lost a little bit of your audio there.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes,
Okay.
indeed. I have
enough.
been to China.
Okay.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, well then, look, let me hand it over to Oliver then. What's your take on all of this? Does BRICS necessarily have to be anti-American because it's anti-Western?
Well, I think most BRICS members are not anti-Western or anti-American. In fact, as I said, India, for example, is actually actively deepening its ties, both trade-wise and security-wise. It's a key ally of the United States. We now have countries like Egypt, which is a long-term recipient of U.S. military aid. Ethiopia is a key ally of the United States in the fight against terror in East Asia. Brazil, as I said, has the United States as its major investor. So there's certainly anti-Western members of the BRICS. Now, I just think it's important to point out that the United States is not mentioned once in the final declaration. I myself have been part of track 2 negotiations of BRICS summits, and I've spoken to diplomats of BRICS for a decade and a half. And I have seen Russian diplomats say, you know, the West is the source of all evil, so we need to include that in our declaration. And then a Brazilian diplomat raised his hand and said, well, we're sort of part of the West too, so we actually wouldn't like to have this kind of wording in the declaration. So from in a particular dimension, I think the United States can almost be, or Europe for that matter, where there's also some concern, you know, should actually commend Brazil and India for being part of BRICS, because they have really been moderating forces for quite some time. I mean, if you read the declaration, there's nothing really in there that strikes you as particularly radical or anti-order. So I think rather than thinking of the BRICS motives as seeking to overthrow the existing order, it's actually let's try to adjust it in a way that makes sense for BRICS countries, considering that, yes, there are tremendous tensions within BRICS. That's just part of diplomacy. Brazil was certainly not happy to see Iran join BRICS, neither was India. They sought to delay expansion. But again, not a revolutionary project, and certainly the majority of BRICS countries have no intention whatsoever to reduce their trade to the United States. Now, that may happen if these tariffs are implemented. And as I said, it may inadvertently unite BRICS. But I certainly think that putting all these countries into the anti-Western box is certainly not a smart strategy for the United States, because you end up pushing countries that seek to preserve ties to you into a corner of supposedly being anti-American.
And I would also add to that, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are also BRICS members as well, and certainly not anti-Western, and with very close ties to the US as well as China. So I think one very interesting dynamic we're seeing here, and I'll go back to my original point that I think we are in a new kind of bipolar world, where the negative side is that countries are in sometimes in a difficult position, being forced to choose, like we see this with Vietnam right now. But at the same time, countries also are benefiting. So if you think about it, you know, from a dating perspective, you know, if you have two people chasing you, you can sometimes get you know, better deal than you can there's only one. And I think certainly countries have been very, very skillful at striking that balance. And, you know, while it lasts, it's certainly It's certainly good for those countries. And I would argue, too, that the competition between China and the United States certainly can be very beneficial. It's I think, a core American belief when it comes to markets that competition brings out the best. And, clearly we do have a competition.
That is perhaps a good point for us to leave it on, because we could continue this debate ad infinitum, because it's such an interesting topic, and I've really appreciated all of your contributions, but we are out of time. So I just want to thank you all for all your analysis. Thanks to our guests, and we apologise for the slight connection issue, but Carla Sands, your audio while we had you is always very valuable. A former US Ambassador and Vice President for Energy and Environment at the America First Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us. Andy Mock, a Beijing-based geopolitical commentator, thank you for your insights. And Oliver Stunkel, the political scientist and a professor at the Zeytinli Vargas Foundation, thanks for your time on CounterPoints. And thank you to everyone at home for joining us on this episode of CounterPoints. You can watch all our latest debates and interviews by subscribing to Al Arabiya English on YouTube. And be sure to follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.